Welcome and thank you for joining the Educating the Billions mini-series where we're discussing the education sector in China. With me today is David and Mark, who will be discussing a little bit about their experiences in advising education businesses in the China market. David, we're fast approaching the end of 2020, and this has been an interesting year for many sectors, but especially education. What do you think will happen at the last quarter of this year and also the trends for next year?
Thanks, Sean. Welcome everybody. I'm speaking here from Shanghai, having just flown back in just a matter of days ago and enjoying the pleasures of quarantine in a Shanghai hotel. And I think that probably summarizes the situation in the market at the current time. COVID has impacted everything. But in terms of the future for British schools looking to open in China, I suspect there's a combination of COVID accelerating what were pre-existing trends in terms of the development of the market. Certainly up until 2018, it was full steam ahead, and as just about every serious-minded independent school in the UK was at least considering the opportunity of opening a school in China for a number of reasons. Obviously, income generation being one of them, but also to export a particular type of education clearly has traction in the Chinese market. And many have made that leap. I think last year, 2019, there were something in excess of 30 different British schools that opened across China, mainly in the first tier cities in Beijing, Shanghai, and Guangzhou, Shenzhen. But 2020 openings, of which there were quite a number scheduled, a lot of them have been postponed because of the difficulties of COVID in recruiting, getting staff across, and simply getting over the red line. So there has been a significant slowdown. And as I said, that slowdown, which clearly was caused by COVID, probably masks some of the pre-existing trends that were already there. So for example, the market's becoming more and more sophisticated. Chinese parents are thinking long and hard about what sort of education do they want for their children. The Chinese government have been making significant changes to the legal framework in which schools can practice. As a result, there has been and will be a slowing down of the number of schools that can viably be successful in the marketplace. I think there will always be a good market for bilingual schools in China. And for those schools that are prepared to take the long view, investors who are prepared to put their money into producing a good quality school and are accepting that their returns won't be fast, then there's a good future. But there are, of course, many schools that were set up by entrepreneurs and particularly property developers who are looking for quite a quick return on their investment. Some of the PE companies will not be prepared to wait for the 5, 6, maybe even 8 years that it takes before you can begin to turn a significant profit. And for these schools, they will be perhaps slightly more problematic in terms of developing their structures, getting the staffing ratios right, getting the quality that they need. And what I suspect will be happening over the next 3, 4 years is there will be quite a lot of M&A, a lot of merging acquisition, changes in the marketplace as different owners take over schools. Some of the school groups, if they're positioned to be able to take over existing schools that are struggling, that may well happen. But I think the marketplace here is very volatile, very changeable. And you can't expect to simply open a school in China and it to become very successful. There was one quite celebrated school that opened last year in Shenzhen, hoping for, I think, in excess of 400 or 500 students, and opened with only 50. And what that suggests to me is the market is more discerning, it's more difficult to recruit, and therefore you have to get it right. I think any school looking to come and open in China therefore needs to be aware of that, not to say don't come, but to just make sure you've got the right deal, you've got the right investor mentality, and that the intermediary that's doing the development work for you understands the needs of the day and the market that you're trying to work in.
Thanks a lot, David. Mark, I know that you've also been working, you are in London, also in a type of quarantine, but Have you seen similar trends that David was speaking about in your reflected in the work that you do for your education clients?
So I think, look, yeah, I think COVID obviously, like David said, it accelerates pre-existing conditions. But I think, strange enough, in education, it may not be like in the retail space. We see retail clients who are closing down in China because they had a pre-existing condition and they were very vulnerable, and COVID just kind of like knocked them off. But I think with education, my feeling is it's more paralysis. It's I think I think firstly there's COVID, but especially from a UK perspective, the uncertainty with Hong Kong or the issues there. I think what we're fielding more than in the past were issues raised by people about doing business with China. So I think that's one hand of it. But I think the second issue is we are seeing people come back to life in the last few weeks. So we had some ongoing education projects that continued, but we've had some recent inquiries, and I think after half-term holidays finish, I think there'll be a bit of renewed interest. I think what we will also see, which David also mentioned, is that a lot of the Chinese partners that people have teamed up with, they weren't really serious about education, and also the schools were perhaps not committed enough to make it very successful. So I think with China, there's still so much opportunity. So much of that country is untouched. If you look at a population graph, Beijing and Shanghai, and even like places like Shenzhen, which we just mentioned, still reflects a very tiny portion of the overall population. So I think bilingual schools do have a big opportunity, but increasingly, whether a school, a UK school, is successful in China will depend a lot on who their partner is, even more so than in the past. And so if you've got the right partner, they'll be able to implement properly. And I think, in the past, we've seen a lot of people who, essentially team up with middlemen, and these middlemen don't really have the resources or understanding to push it through. So my expectation is it will not be perhaps the heady days where everybody was just rushing in with reckless abandon, but I don't think China's going to go away because it is too big an opportunity. And I think probably we're over the worst of the anti-Chinese sentiment, which I think it's swung far too much, in a negative sentiment. And I think that is now slowly subsiding a bit.
Thanks, Mark. I think, we are living in a COVID world. So, David, do you think that it is increasingly important for schools and universities in the UK to have a physical presence, a physical campus in China to attract new students? Is that one of the trends for this year and possibly next year?
I think there's still a very significant pickup in the independent sector, the secondary education sector in the UK. From what I'm hearing, there's still a lot of Chinese parents that are looking to try and send their children overseas. And I don't think that trend is going to change. In fact, I think the British marketplace in the UK for Chinese students is going to be very healthy for the next few years, particularly because of the Chinese-American difficulties. The results of the election in November, it will determine that, we suspect. If there's a return of the current regime and the trade wars continue, then I think the British market will do very well. The China market is changing significantly, as I think I mentioned before, not just because of economic slowdown, relatively speaking. We know the recovery's been fantastic after COVID in China. But also because of the political changes, where quite honestly the Chinese government, I think, quite understandably decided they wanted to control the expansion of schools in China, because there were just simply so many of them that were opening up. They wanted to make sure that the sort of problems that occurred on the streets of Hong Kong did not occur on the streets of Shanghai and Beijing. So more controls over curriculum, more controls over the sort of admission into the bilingual schools that we're describing have been instituted in the last couple of years. And that will change and slow down the development of the market. and it will make Chinese parents a little bit more discerning as to how they go about picking the school they want for their children to go to. But as Mark says, I do think for the school that has developed the right product, got the right investor, has built the right relationships with government, there is a very bright future for these schools, because they're offering exactly what the Chinese market needs. They're offering schools that will deliver very good quality English, very good quality Chinese cultural understanding, which will enable students to know their place within Chinese society. One of the problems of many of the international schools, the English language schools for foreigners, is that any Chinese passport, any Chinese student with a foreign passport who went to one of those schools lost pretty much all track of their Chinese heritage, because it was an all English curriculum, international curriculum. The bilingual schools have got rid of that. They've reintroduced the Chinese element back into the curriculum. Parents love that. They also like the fact that they're getting the English and the international curriculum opportunity, so they can go to American and British universities. So they're going to remain. And as Mark says, across China, second, third tier cities, you will see these schools where they're properly managed and set up taking off. But if you don't get the business plan right, and you don't get the staffing structure right, particularly in a time when COVID has made it very difficult to get international teachers into China, and therefore you're having to look to employ more and more Chinese staff to deliver the international curriculum or use online resources. The management of these schools is becoming more complex, and as a result, it's by no means the golden goose that it was a few years ago. I think the market will be there and will remain there. Chinese parents don't want to remain within the Gaokao structure in large numbers. We've seen that drift away from it. But equally, they don't want to go to very average schools that are not properly resourced and properly staffed. They want to make sure their children get the best. And actually, we are seeing, in response to some of the government changes recently, a return to public sector education. Parents are choosing to go back to the state school system. Whether that's a long-term trend, we don't know. Quite likely, I suspect that people will move back into the private sector later as regulation changes. But at the moment, it's quite a volatile situation, and I think it's really going to be those with deep pockets and a commitment to quality that are going to see success in the future.
Thanks a lot for that answer. David, living in a COVID world, do you think that one of the trends for this year and the following will be the importance of physical campuses for schools and higher education in China, so that they can continue to their offering to the Chinese students?
Yeah, obviously in terms of schools, secondary schools in the UK, they're not opening campuses in order to be able to attract students for their own market. They're looking at them as separate entities that can be educational providers in that location, and obviously will bring an income base through back to the UK. In terms of the university market, there's a whole range of different arrangements have been set up. I don't think there are a large number of new licenses for new campuses to be opened up as separate universities like Nottingham Ningbo, Liverpool Xi'an, and Duke Kushan, and Shanghai NYU. Those licenses, I suspect, are going to be less forthcoming. Though actually, I have heard that one or two more may be being offered. But a lot of universities do have bases or offices or even study centres in China, where they're able to teach and deliver their own curriculum or aspects of it in China to the Chinese student base. And I think that will happen and will continue to happen, and probably will be absolutely essential. I think the trends at the moment do suggest that a lot of Chinese students are trying to get out of China if they can to go to the UK. I think some of the figures suggest between 50 and 70% have actually turned up for their courses in the UK this October. But clearly, if you can provide a service in situ for students to study in China, that's going to be a genuine commercial value. And I think universities will try to do that. And at the same time, to developing a really, really very good online presence. And I think that's a bigger issue in terms of investment opportunities, both for schools at all levels really right through from primary to higher education, delivering high quality online presence for situations when you can't get to the bricks and mortar school, be it in the UK, America, or actually here in China. You have to work from home because of lockdown. Those systems and facilities to be able to deliver high quality education to the student direct to their front rooms is clearly a market that's going through the roof, and some of the providers are doing a really good job. And I see that mixture of online, offline continuing even more into the future, particularly as providers have to start looking at the cost base of whether or not a bricks and mortar school bringing in large numbers of teachers with significant headcount is going to be a viable proposition as we move into a more competitive marketplace. At the moment, parents are prepared to spend quite large sums of money on education, but there's quite a lot of Chinese providers coming into the market. They're cutting the cost of education and still doing it at quite high quality. So you can see a mixed model coming in over the next few years. And actually the Brits, I think, are in a very good position to be able to create some good software and good platforms to be able to facilitate that. And I think many of the schools will be in that market if they can. So yeah, it's a complicated marketplace. But as I said before, for those that have got a little bit of entrepreneurism and a bit of courage, and for investors that are prepared to take the long run, there's plenty of opportunities.
Thanks for that, David. And Mark, what are you seeing from the legal aspect of it?
Well, I think what we're seeing is, firstly, I think, COVID, it shows what is possible with online learning, but it also shows what we want with our lives. And so I think, we've learned that we can do online learning much better than we would have thought we could, but we also I think people realize it's not a substitute for physical meeting. So I think what we've seen is there's a lot of interest in EdTech. We've seen also a lot of companies looking at the online tutoring, where perhaps overseas tutors will specifically work with children on specific, so a very targeted approach. So I think these are the things we've seen. I think online education, even for adults, I think the attrition rate is something in the high 80% in the US, and that's adults who want to do an online course themselves, they drop out. So it's a bit much to expect children. So I think we will. You asked whether there's still, an importance for the physical meeting place. I think it is, but I think, online will be an enhancement of the education and also perhaps help children with specific issues. And that's what we're seeing clients come with. And also not just edutech, but like edutainment, I guess you would call it, where you merge education with entertainment for kids, and online apps, these kind of testing apps and things like that. So I think there's a lot happening there. And then I think on the point that David made about the UK being, a safe harbor for Chinese students, I think this is true as well. I think, people are less reticent about traveling than we thought. I mean, at the moment, they're not doing it unless they have to. But I think this will relatively quickly subside. And I think it doesn't really matter what happens in the US election. I think a lot of Chinese parents don't really view America anymore as a very friendly place, but also not a safe place, I think, is a criticism of the US. And I think Australia did quite well, or did very well with education, but I guess now it's not seen as a very friendly place for Chinese students. So I think the UK is well positioned to actually pick up a lot of that Anglo-Saxon students, the Chinese that would like to go to an Anglo-Saxon, because the UK is also has that heritage of education, and I think it's very appealing. And I think the UK is now much more interested in pushing it than it was maybe 5 years ago. So for all those reasons, I think there's a lot to be seen, both online, but also for the UK as a destination for education.
Thank you both for your answers. We will have other episodes on this playlist that will cover some of the topics discussed in more detail. Please feel free to check those out. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for the other episodes.